It's really striking how powerful these tapes we play in our head. There's a book out called Soundtracks by John Acuff that talks about this. So even though you had outward success, you had verification and validation that you were in the right spot and you were making a big impact. You were sitting on these executive groups, teams at a young age. And even with that, in the real world, that evidence, it couldn't be right. And subconsciously, it sounded like it was still driving you to kind of escape before some presumed bad outcome.
Hey, you're absolutely right. I didn't want to be found out. I didn't want, my biggest fear was somebody to say, you're an imposter. Like, and you're exactly right. The biggest limiting belief that goes way back to childhood for me is, who am I? Who am I? Growing up, I had an older brother who was an all-American athlete. And from a very early age, I saw how that gave him acceptance and popularity, for a lack of better words. And I placed all my stock in the fact that was how you built it, right? You had to be good at sports. And so I went on this journey to beat my brother in sports. It never happened, and it was never gonna happen. And so as I get older, I realize how many of those voices and soundtracks that you said have just been played on repeat for so long, not because of any evidence the external world gave me. It was really the idea I created in my head.
Welcome to Titans of Transition, featuring real-life stories, anecdotes, and inspiration about pivotal career moments from leaders who have been there.
Payne Schoen, welcome to Titans of Transition podcast.
Thank you. I'm super excited to be here.
Yeah, listen, I got to know you as serving on the Maxwell team with me, and we do some volunteer work as part of that large community. There's over 30,000 certified coaches now internationally around the world. And I was really pleased and happy to meet you. And every year, at least once a year, I think that we have the International Maxwell Certification meeting in Orlando twice a year usually, but we had the COVID in the last year or so. But we recently went to another IMC meeting where I got to see you face to face. We've been working together virtually. And there was a moment in one of the large general sessions where you were invited up on stage with Valerie Burton to demonstrate the powerful practice of coaching. You volunteered to do that with her. She's our faculty in charge of the coaching area, the coaching lane. And after that session, it was very impactful. You got a lot of positive feedback. But after that session, I said to myself, I really want to have you on the podcast to talk a little bit about your journey. And I know in the past year or so, you have come to some discoveries about yourself. So first of all, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, what you're currently doing now with your consulting business, and what your background is.
Yeah. So I am from Quincy, Illinois. I live here with my wife and two daughters. I have a 6-year-old and a 3.5-year-old. And my background is, I've got a couple of different things that I've been able to do and been honored to learn from, which we'll dive into. But spent the first part of my career in professional accounting and financial accounting, excuse me. And then I transitioned more to operational roles. And now over the last year, I've transitioned out of an operational role and started a company based on a need that I saw that's focused specifically on professional and business development. And it's been a fun ride for the last 9 months, and definitely had an incredible IMC experience that turned the metric and really helped progress my business.
That's awesome. Yeah, so obviously the theme of this podcast is transitions And I believe that we go through different periods of transition. We typically sense these transition periods when we have a big shift, usually in our job or our life. We often think about a transition when it's right on top of us, but actually we can be in transition and not even know it for a period of time because there's something operating in the background. I like to refer to it as a dissonance or some friction. Something's not quite feeling right that causes us to think about making a shift. Mm-hmm. And so I think that it ties into the conversation you had with Valerie, but it also ties into this change you have made recently out of the financial area into your own consulting business, really more in the area of leadership and more in the area of how to grow and how to become your absolute best. And I know you have masterminds and things of that nature too, which I hope we can get into. But let's start, and can we talk a little bit about your journey and maybe some of a few of the transitions you've gone through and what you discovered along the way?
Yeah, for sure. And actually, as you just articulated it, it helped me get even clearer on probably what was happening. That you used a D word, and I don't even know what it was. Yeah, can you define that for me?
Well, dissonance, I think of it usually like in a musical context, where you can have harmony where the notes are this certain interval apart, and it sounds good and pleasant, but then if you have things that are kind of not that together, if you will, it doesn't feel comfortable. It's a sad feeling to hear those notes. And sometimes we don't know what's going on, but something's not quite right. We can't put our finger on it.
Yeah. So that is a great word for it, because I really think of my transitions in two buckets. I think of the first bucket really being fueled and driven by imposter syndrome and fear, and the second bucket more divinely led. And when you use the word dissonance, that's going to be a new word for the vocabulary, so thank you. That is absolutely what was happening. And in the first bucket, I was not consciously aware of it. In the second bucket, I was much more consciously aware. So as I said, I started my career in professional accounting, and you know me, and some of your listeners may, it couldn't have been a more conflicting opportunity or career for a guy of my skill sets and personality style. I am not an internal processor. I am not a honed in, detail oriented individual, and I don't like working alone. And so it didn't take long for me to figure out that I was not like everybody else around me. And I came to this point where I realized I had two options. I could change my profession, or I could change myself. And unfortunately, at the time, I didn't have the ability to think big picture and change my career. So I really started changing myself and tried to fit in with those around me. I worked really hard on developing areas that weren't my strengths or skill sets. And it led me to really, if I'm completely transparent and open, a dark place where I really battled quite a bit of depression because I was working really, really hard to get better at these things and couldn't.
Yeah, if I just camp there for a second, because I hear this a lot, and I think it's kind of coming back and reinforcing a notion I had earlier, and that is that we can become skilled in almost anything. I mean, there are certain things, no, but there's a pretty broad range of things we can do pretty well at. But I think that it's harder for people who it's not their natural modus operandi, if you will. It's not their natural MO, or it's not their gifting to bring in the divine. It's not how God has gifted you. So yes, you can do it, but you have to expend a tremendous amount of energy, and over the long term, it's just not sustainable. Yeah. And I think that's actually one of the things that comes up. Yeah. Is this sense of get so totally worn out. Yeah. And exhausted.
Yeah. Yeah. so true. And I wasn't at a place in my life where I could realize what was going on at that time. So I found I tried to double down on getting better in the financial accounting world, and it led me to burnout, and I was done. And so I had to make a change. And the only opportunity that presented itself at the time was in operational leadership. And a couple of former New York City financial investors were investing in these investment bankers was the word I was thinking about. They were investing in these newspapers, these rural newspapers, and they wanted somebody to run the company. I knew nothing about the newspaper industry, but I knew I had to get out of accounting. And so I jumped at the opportunity, and I asked the guys what I should do. Like, how do I do this? And they said, just start building relationships with the heads of the newspapers and the people. And that was something I was pretty good at. I could develop relationships. And so I started. And we were not doing great when I started, and it was interesting how over the next 6 to 12 months, some of the really poor performing newspapers started to turn around. And I couldn't really figure out why that was. And I was convinced in my head that it wasn't because of, the little time I was spending investing in these people and earning their relationships. I just thought it was something else. And that's when the fear and that imposter syndrome really set in for me to understand what's going on. And so we continued to do better and better. And actually the next year I got rewarded financially because of it. And it was actually crippling because it reinforced my limiting beliefs in the sense of now I got financial gain because of the performance, but I still had no idea. And
so why didn't you have an idea? You said imposter syndrome, but was it that you were your mind was taking you back to what you thought was valuable? Is that what it was? I'm just trying to understand that disconnection there.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it probably was a combination of two things. It was the experience in accounting in the sense of all the effort and energy it took to get a little bit of success there. And then I come in here and it was really natural for me. And I connected with the individuals. I was from a small town. That's where all these newspapers were. And I like people. And so for me, I think it didn't feel like it did in the accounting world, and it seemed to be too easy and too simple. That couldn't be the answer.
I think that's really important. Too easy, too simple. Therefore, couldn't be the answer. Not valuable, maybe even.
Absolutely.
Unless you work hard, it can't be valuable.
Yeah.
Even if it was successful, I mean, you saw the success, but you were still discounting it because of that prevailing paradigm that you had to work.
Yeah. Yeah. Growing up, I saw my dad working 5.5 days a week, a lot of hours, and that meant, he did an incredible job and built an incredible business. But to me, it was lots of hours, and that was reflective in the accounting world because everything's billed by hours. In the newspaper world, it wasn't, right? So I found myself really getting in my own head again and getting scared, to be completely honest, that somebody was going to find me out and I was going to be, called a fraud. And so another opportunity came and presented itself. This time came out of nowhere, and it was to build out the administrative functions in a financial service firm, pretty well established and built financial service firm, law firm, in our community. And so I jumped at that opportunity because I was really running away from the fear of being caught, right? And it's funny because I found myself in a very similar environment as the accounting world, with me being very different than everybody else. And that was a clash for quite a while. But I took something from the newspapers that I realized, and that was the power of the relationship. And so I started to build relationship with the team members. And again, experiencing some of the very similar results that I had with the newspapers was we were starting to have success and build momentum. And once again, it was like, this can't be what it is.
This can't be right.
I can't be right. And so I started getting in my head again. And at about the same time, I also started really doubling down on my personal growth. That's when I joined the John Maxwell team and started really developing my personal awareness. And so they were kind of running parallel. But again, another opportunity came and presented itself to start a team, help this time in the financial service world, an advisor that I knew who had built a really solid practice wanted to build out a team. And so it was like, wow, start from scratch? That sounds like a lot of fun and sounds like something that's right in my wheelhouse and my skill set. And so it took me a little bit longer to make that decision. I could have spent about 6 months thinking through that and finally got to a place where I thought I was making the decision based on what was best for my next step in my career. But again, it was largely, in hindsight, largely fueled by this fear of being figured out. I was, the youngest person at this law firm in leadership. I was, I think, 30 when I started, sitting on an executive committee where the next youngest guy was probably 45 or 50. And to help guide vision at that young of an age, I wasn't at a place where I understood that there was a skill set that I had that was uncommon. So I left there. Yeah. Were you going to say something?
No, it's just, to me, it's really striking how powerful these tapes we play in our head, there's a book out called Soundtracks by John Acuff that talks about this. There's a lot of things about it, but it's really interesting how powerful they can be. So even though you had outward success, you had verification and validation that you were in the right spot and you were making a big impact. You were sitting on these executive groups, teams at a young age. And even with that, in the real world, that evidence, it couldn't be right. And subconsciously, it sounded like it was still driving you to kind of escape before some presumed bad outcome.
You're absolutely right. I didn't want to be found out. I didn't want. My biggest fear was somebody say you're an imposter. Like who are, and you're exactly right. The biggest limiting belief that goes way back to childhood for me is who am I? Who am I? Growing up, I had an older brother who was an all-American athlete, and from a very early age, I saw how that gave him acceptance and popularity, for a lack of better words, and that's where I placed all my stock in the fact that was how you built it, right? You had to be good at sports, and so I went on this journey to beat my brother in sports. It never happened, and it was never gonna happen. And so as I get older, I realize how many of those voices, the soundtracks that you said, have just been played on repeat for so long, not because of anything any evidence the external world gave me. It was really the idea I created in my head.
When you decided to invest in yourself, joining Maxwell team in personal growth, what was driving that?
Divine intervention. I had, as a man of faith, and I know you are as well, yes. I had a friend of mine come back from an INC, and it had changed her life. And it just so happened to line up. I was still at the law firm, and I had just pitched him on an idea of really developing their people. And that was a turning point in my career, because it was early at the law firm, and I didn't understand communication styles very well. And so for me, as I shared earlier, I'm a very high-level thinker. I like to brainstorm with other people and then get into the details. And I was pitching this idea to them, and I had done high-level work, and they were asking questions down here in the details, and I couldn't bring them back up because we hadn't decided to move on this initiative. We had probably 10 or 12 initiatives we were thinking through, and I'm like, I can't do deep work on all 12 of these to get us moving forward. And so I was up here and they were down here, and I was getting frustrated. And the final question they asked me was, why do you think this is going to work? And in a moment of weakness and immaturity, I responded with the first thing I could think about, and that was because my gut's telling me. And you can only imagine how a group of lawyers responded to me saying, my gut, what does that mean?
Right.
And that's actually what led me to the John Maxwell team, because I realized I needed some turnkey solutions and to use and borrow John's name because they knew John, and that's what led me to the team for sure.
Wow. Okay, so where did we leave off? What position did we leave off?
So I'll land the plane here pretty quickly. I was at the financial service firm, right, and it was pretty quick. We realized that our visions weren't aligned, and what I saw we could do was not really what he wanted to do. And I found myself in a unique position at the time. Now I was really in a role that was a glorified administrative position, and he didn't need that or need me in that position. And about the same time, I had finally built up enough courage because 4 years previously, when I joined the John Maxwell team, I had started participating in masterminds. And I finally, very early on when I started participating, I realized I wanted to start one. And it took me about 3 years to get that one going. And it actually was, again, in a moment of complete frustration of my lack of action, that I decided in a board meeting I was going to ask somebody to join a mastermind. And I hadn't thought about how I was going to describe it or what I wanted to do. And so afterwards, I just word vomited on him. And as I stopped to get his response, he seemed confused. So I did what I thought made most sense. Let's give him some more words. So I vomited some more words, and when I was finally out of words to describe it and ways to reframe it, he said, "Is that like a book club?" And I felt defeated, and all I could say was kind of, but not really. And that almost derailed me, and I almost didn't ask anybody else, but I got enough courage up to schedule a meeting with a good friend of mine who we meet a couple times a year. And so we sat down, and we were about 45 minutes into an hour-long meeting, and the voices in my head were telling me, don't tell him, don't ask him. This is not the time. You can ask him next time. And in a moment of courage, I went ahead and told him, and his response just blew me away. He said, "You'll never believe this." I said, "What?" He said, "On my 2020 goals," it was 2019. It was November 2019 when I was having this conversation with him. He said, "On my 2020 goals was to go outside of our community and find a professional development group exactly like you just defined." And so he said he was all in. And that was another inflection point in the sense of he was in. So then I asked 4 other people who I knew very well. They were all in. And so I was excited. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but I had 5 people and myself signed up for it. And that's when God stepped in again, and he put another name on my heart. And instantly I said, "Yep, he's not going to work in this group." I didn't know him well. I'd only met him twice. He reminded me a lot of people that I got to know, and brought out the insecurities I had developed in professional accounting and also in the law firm. And so I just said, "Yeah, thanks God. I see where you're going with that, but I've got a better plan," right? and we know how God responds when we say that. And so this guy just starts showing up everywhere over the next 30 days. And the straw that broke the camel's back was he called me and wanted my advice on an investment, a significant investment he was going to make. And I said, "All right, God, I see what you're doing here. I'll ask him." But it still took me about 30 days to build up the courage to finally ask. And when I did, and my hand was physically shaking when I called him, I described what I was planning on doing and waited for his response, which it felt like hours. And then from the other end of the phone, I hear, "I have no idea what you're talking about." And so it just fueled those insecurities. The voices in my head said, "See, Payne, I told you. What are you doing?" But then I heard him say, "But I'll join." And I was so caught off guard and so shocked. The only response I could get out was, "Really?" And so I almost sabotaged it from the start. And so that group started in January of 2020, 2 months before the world was shut down with this pandemic, right? And that last guy invited was a doctor. And the way he spoke into our group in a time when
Oh man.
one news station is on this end of the spectrum and the other is on this end of the perspective or spectrum, and they're predicting 13 to 30% death rate. He spoke right down the middle, and he called it 6 months before the CDC came out and actually verified what he said. And his voice in that group dramatically impacted our community, because another member of that group is the lead pastor of one of the largest churches here in our town. And I watched as the doctor spoke into the group, and the pastor went on stage Sunday after Sunday and spoke truth and hope and faith to a congregation of 1,500 people.
Wow.
And I was just blown away with the impact that had.
Yeah, boy, you've said a lot. I mean, how this group came about, trying to explain what a mastermind was, feeling like an imposter again when, did you call it word vomit?
Yeah.
When you couldn't find the right words to make a connection with someone who was wired very differently than you, right?
Yes.
And yet, you had to make some course corrections along the way, and yet that group has become vital to this whole group of guys, is it?
It is, yeah, a group of 7 men.
Yeah, and I know it's sort of a core of what you're doing right now. I know it fuels you and it encourages you. So there's some three-dimensional chess being played upstairs.
Oh, for sure.
For everyone, sometimes you think, you're going to put something together and help everybody else, and then you find out you get help through the process.
So true.
Boy, there's a lot that I want to reflect back on. But one key thing here is, again, I'm going to underscore how pervasive and almost insidious these bad tapes in our head can be.
Yeah.
And how I think it's maybe a takeaway that when you're in the wrong spot, your energy tends to get drained.
Yes.
When you are in the right spot, it comes too easy, almost.
Yes.
And we discount the value. But when you are in the right spot, that's where you can really have influence and where you can really be a leader, I believe.
Yeah.
Regardless of what it is. You don't have to be leading an organization or a company, or you can just lead by who you are.
Yeah.
Just by what you model.
Absolutely.
But there's another thing in here too that I want, and maybe it ties back to the conversation with Valerie, because I remember a little bit of that conversation where there was a back and forth with her on stage, Valerie being this top level coach, where you were questioning your courage, and where she said, "What are you talking about?" and gave you examples of how you have exercised your courage.
Yeah. I would piggyback off what you said. When you're working in an area of gifting, it almost comes too easy, right? And when you've experienced the challenge and the struggle of working outside your gifting, you become conditioned to the belief that it can't be this natural. It can't be this impactful. And so you reinforce what you're saying. And so absolutely, I mean, it was 8 months into that first mastermind. I still didn't know why the people kept showing up. And I didn't have the courage to ask them. And then it was that mastermind where we set goals, and I set the goal of starting my business and doubling down on the relationship with my wife, because I'd really put that on the back burner. And those were inflection points, because I spoke into existence those two things. And you fast forward about 3 months, 4 months, when I was getting close to when I said I wanted to start that business, and I was getting cold feet. And I thought I was crazy. What are you doing walking away from a job where you're making a healthy six figures to start at zero. I got two little kids. Like, that's just crazy. And that's when God divinely intervened and pushed me off the mountain, and I found myself in this business. And then you talked about courage, and it was a lot of small acts of courage. You mentioned the mastermind, and it was true. Asking the second person after the first person was a train wreck because of what I did. I wasn't ready, right? And continuing to show up at the mastermind despite not knowing and feeling really inadequate to sit around this table of very influential individuals and lead it, right? And then you're talking about a couple of times that Valerie pointed out. I mean, I played golf with a group of incredible men because at the IMC because I asked. I kind of inserted myself, right? And then I posted on a post that I saw on Facebook after getting scared about an idea that God had planted in my head, and I really wanted to numb it. So I hop on Facebook, and the post I see is the executive assistant of the president of the John Maxwell team asking for volunteers to go on stage with Valerie. And I thought back to that mastermind story and what would have happened if I hadn't asked that last guy, the professional, and the dramatic impact, negative impact it would have had because he wouldn't have been a part of that group. And so I stepped in, but not without hesitation, because I kind of bartered with God and said, I'll do this, but I'm going to make my topic, because I had to put a topic in the comment box, so vague and so bland that I knew she wouldn't pick me. And, much to my surprise, I ended up on stage with Valerie. Yeah.
And thousands of people, right? Yeah. I mean, I think we had several thousand there in person, and then we had, of course, there was a hybrid virtual event as well. There, as we mentioned earlier, there's over 30,000 people internationally. Not all those people got on, but a large number, I'm sure, did. So, acts of courage, but yet again, discounted, because your foot is planted in this old paradigm of what it means to be worthy of something. Yeah, and it's a powerful, I think, lesson. So I kind of segueing back, and one of the things I like to do is try to unpack, and it's corny, but I think it's a good question to use to unpack lessons as we go through these stories, these transition stories, by asking the question, what advice would you give to your 25-year-old self, let's say? Yeah. Knowing what you know now, if you could show up.
That's a great question. The first advice I would give myself is learn about what your skill sets are, and understand what comes naturally, and don't discredit that for don't discredit a lack of struggle for a skill that you were uniquely given, because I think things would have been dramatically different. Well, actually, I'll be transparent in front of your audience, as I've learned to be in front of audiences over the last 6 weeks. But when I was 15 years old, I felt like I was called to ministry, and I could see myself speaking from stage. And I happened to be at a church retreat, a conference, and I got this dream from God. And in my head, the only way you could do that and influence people was through ministry, right? And becoming a minister. And at 15, the only thing I was focused on was becoming a millionaire. And so those two paths didn't align, right? And so I internalized that, and that's probably the start of me going down a different path that was full of struggle and difficulty. And I'm glad I did, because it made me who I am today. But things could have been a lot different. And I'm not saying easier, but I could be much farther down the road had I just learned to listen to that intuition a little bit earlier. So that probably, combined with know yourself, get to know who you are, but listen to your intuition, would be the advice that I would give myself at 25.
Yeah, I think it's also important to qualify a little bit, and we talk a lot about what comes naturally being a good indicator of a direction you should go into. But let's be real. We also need to invest in our skills, invest in how we use our natural giftings.
Yep.
It isn't like, no preparation is required for anything. Another member of the teaching faculty on the Maxwell team is Roddy Galbraith, who does the speaking lane, and he's pretty strong about how important preparation is. So I do want to balance the equation a little bit there for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, you're right on. And, too much of, I think I like to say too much of any strength becomes a weakness. And so solely focusing on building relationships or working in a gifting, it doesn't give you permission to say, well, I'm not any good at that, so I'm not going to do it, which is exactly what you just said.
Right. So the other thing that I like to do is to talk about things that are coming up. But before we get there, I just want to pull this out because as this thing gets interesting, you played football, did you not?
I did, yeah. I played.
Are some of these guys in this mastermind friends of yours from football or no?
They aren't, no.
Oh, okay. So I'm confused by that. But
yeah.
I do know you maintain a relationship with guys that you played football with. Right?
Yeah. I mean, a real quick story on that. So it was interesting. I played college football, and I got to know some guys really, really well. And like most people, when they leave college, you kind of leave. Unfortunately, I left those relationships behind, and fast forward about 10, maybe some of them 14 years, and I got, again, another idea of starting a call during COVID to reconnect these guys, because we had some of the strongest relationships you can have when you battle on a proverbial football field, right? And do the work and put that effort in side by side with people, you develop really, really strong relationships. And so I got the idea mid-summer 2020 to start this group. And once again, those limiting beliefs got the best of me for a while. And for about 8 months, I just sat on that idea, and I just happened to find myself on a call with one of the guys. And I happened to share the idea with him. He's like, "You need to do that." And I'm like, "Yeah, but I'm busy." And we always, the typical excuse, we're busy. But then he's like, "Well, then I'm going to do it." And I was like, what? I got a little bit of competitiveness in me. I'm like, what? Let's do it together. And so we started it earlier, the beginning of this summer. We started monthly calls, and we've had one once a month. And I mean, we range from 70 people on the call to 15, 20, which has been really cool to see the different dynamics. But then we also actually just had our first in-person event. One of the guys we played with in college, he coaches for the University of Pittsburgh, and they were playing Western Michigan, who just so happens to have 3 of the coaches we played for coaching at Western. And so about a half dozen or so guys made the trip to Pittsburgh and spent a weekend together. It was just really cool to reconnect, and a good chunk of those guys I haven't seen for 12 or 13 years, and it was really fun to get back together.
That's awesome. Let me ask you this question. Mm-hmm. How is football different than work experience in regards to gifting and how that played out on the field? What position did you play? What position did you first try to play?
That's a great question. Oh, that's a really fascinating way to look at this. So I played outside linebacker and strong safety in college. We played a 3-3-5 stack. And in high school, I played fullback and linebacker. But my freshman year of high school, I tried out for receiver. My brother was a wide receiver, and I wanted to get playing time. And so I thought that if I was a receiver, I could get playing time. And that was not the case. And I wasn't fast enough. It wasn't the right fit. And so they moved me to fullback and linebacker, and I played behind a couple of guys, but it just so happens my freshman year, because of injuries, I found myself playing and playing late in the season. And then fast forward to college, I was so determined to play that I walked into camp in better shape and ready to play more so than most of the guys playing my position. And I actually had a starting position from day one because I was the only linebacker that passed the conditioning test. But then I also earned that spot right over the course of camp. And so it's really unique to ask that question. And so I think as I reflect and for the first time really think of it that way, I found myself in environments that were conducive to my skill set and strength, and so much of development and growth is talked about, and leadership is talked about in sports. And so it just came naturally. And so once again, what came easily and naturally couldn't be the answer, because I've spent more time in the weight room and on the track getting fast than I did in my studies. And so it's amazing how.
The other thing I'm just thinking, and this is a stretch because I did not play football, so I'm going to show my ignorance.
Okay.
But a linebacker has to read the offense, right?
Yeah.
And so that's a highly to be good, you have to have all the physical abilities. That's your entry point. But to be really good, you have to be really quick on being able to read and be intuitive, I would think.
Yeah, it's reaction. Yeah, you got to know what's coming at you.
And just from talking to you, not even knowing this about you until today, Payne, you're really intuitive. I think you're spontaneous. You think quickly. This is probably wrong. I'll just say it. I can cut it out later if it is. But a receiver typically runs patterns and maybe has to make adjustments at the very end, but it's not the same as a linebacker.
You're right.
If a receiver is improvising too much, that's the other word, you're an improviser, I think. If they're improvising too much, that's not necessarily a good thing.
Yeah.
Because the ball's going to land in the field because the quarterback may not even be able to see that well. He's going to put the ball in the right place. Is that true?
It's so true. Wow, Joe, that was incredible for a guy who doesn't give himself enough credit. But you're absolutely right, and I've never thought of it that way. And you can even take it a step farther. I played offense in high school. I ended up in defense in college. I played both ways in high school. Offense is very regimented, structured. You know the play, you have a job, you go and do it. And defense is very much, I have to make a read and go. And so, wow, yeah, it's absolutely intuitive. It's absolutely more roll with it.
Draw the parallel a little further. A good accounting person, you don't want to be like that.
No.
You don't want a good accounting person being creative, making up things along the way.
Creative accounting lands you in jail.
Right.
Yeah, that's that's, you know what, that's fascinating that just can't, this is the power of.
And you have to commit, you have to take risks,
Yeah.
Do I blitz or do I lay back?
Yeah. First, is it a run or is it a pass? That's where it starts. And you have to make that read like that. And sometimes you misread it, but you have to commit, right? And go with it. So that's, you've just brought new awareness to me. And that's the power of conversation, especially for a guy who.
So I think too that you take that wiring and you apply it even within your sweet spot. You're in your sweet spot now, right?
Yeah.
So, but it's in the way you approach things. This is one of the reasons why, and I'll just throw it on the table. I got certified in the Colby instrument years ago. Catherine Colby, she has this conative method. It's like a disc kind of a thing.
Yeah, I know it.
But it's focused on how you spend creative energy, not what your preference is on. It's more what you actually do, how you actually behave. And I brought out the MO earlier, the modus operandi. And she uses that term a lot. So in my world, being a scientist for about a decade, then switching into IT leadership, I'm very much like you. Budgeting used to just wear me out.
Yep.
As a CIO, I hated it. Every year I had to approach, and it's very structured, pretty much the same every year. They changed the target numbers, but I had to trick myself to get enough energy up to even complete it. I said, well, I'm gonna approach it differently this year, because if it was new and fresh, it was interesting for me and I could get my energy going. But if I didn't approach it in a new way, it just wouldn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
So true.
So if someone, even a mastermind study, even, taking some base materials, if you're too structured, probably it's going to bore you to tears. You probably have to put your own unique spin on it.
Yep. Very much so. Yeah.
And then you get excited.
I do. You're right.
And take on new opportunities. So let's pivot now, because we camped too long on that.
That's okay.
My fault.
Yeah.
But you stepped out in courage, and this is going to surprise you because I didn't say I was going to bring this up, but you're going to do Live the Lead here in another, week?
2 weeks. 3 weeks from
2
today.
weeks.
Yeah, 3 weeks from today.
You want to just tell folks what that is?
Yeah, so the Live to Lead conference is just a leadership experience, a world-class leadership experience with teachers like John Maxwell, Ed Milet, Jeff Henderson, Jamie Kern-Lima. And I initially wasn't going to do it because there's another summit, the Global Leadership Summit. Are you familiar with that, Joe?
Yeah, it was out of Willow Creek.
It was. Yeah. It was
originally?
founded out of Willow Creek. Craig Rochelle leads it up now. And our community live streams that. Very similar idea in the sense of world-class speakers live streamed in. You can hear these guys, and I think it's a good event. My struggle with it is, you're going to be surprised with this, the lack of engagement. It's very individualized, and you take the notes, and it's really on you to execute and apply. And I don't strive and succeed in those environments, and so I didn't want to have another one like that. And so it wasn't until I realized that I could put my spin on it and I could create more of a workshop style function. And so I'll stream in these videos, but then I get to control what happens after. And so I've created and taken from the mastermind concept that I have going right now, the power of groupthink, and really the power of speaking out what you're going to do. It's accountability, right? And it's goals. And my goals started happening as soon as I spoke them into existence, whether it be starting my business or my relationship with my wife, which is stronger than ever. It was because I first spoke them into existence. And you spoke them into existence in a community. In a community. Because you're a people person. Exactly. And so that's what I'm doing in that day. I've got it structured so that there'll be round tables, people can think, and I've got facilitators at each table. And then I wanted to take it one step farther and create a real local flavor to it. So I'm having two panels. There's a women in leadership panel that actually my wife is going to facilitate, and some of my mastermind participants are going to be panelists on. And then I've asked some really influential leaders within our community that have helped us lead through the last 18 months to sit on a panel. I've got the higher education, the medical industry, the faith community, the agriculture community, because we're big into agriculture here in the Midwest, present and represented to really speak to the audience on how to lead and what endurance leadership looks like, because I think that's really where we're at right now. It's huge. Yeah, so I'm really excited. Congratulations on doing that. I did one a few years back. It was great. Thank you. So it's live streamed from Atlanta. Yeah. So internationally. Yeah. And where will you be hosting it locally? Yeah. So I'm hosting it at the church that we attend. It's Madison Park Christian Church. Okay. Yeah. I'll put that in the show notes. Awesome. At this point, first of all, thanks again for being on the podcast. Yeah. It's been a lot of fun. It has. It's been fun getting to know you over the last six to 8 months, and you're a special person, and you've impacted my life dramatically in ways you probably will never know. And I'm humbled to be on your podcast. So thank you. Oh, thanks, man. How can people find you, Payne? Yeah, the easiest way would
Web addresses,
Yep.
whatever.
Easiest way is my website, PayneSchoenConsulting.com. You can toss that in the show notes if you don't mind too.
Okay.
There's a link to direct message me or schedule a call, and that's the easiest. I'm on social as well. I've got Facebook and Instagram, and I was just talking to a client of mine yesterday. I don't really have a strategy other than I want people to get my posts and be filled up. I think in this world, it's very easy to get caught up, and I know what it's like to get in your own head and be reinforced by messaging that may or may not be intentional. And so I use it as a platform for encouragement and optimism and hope.
Well, I will say you've encouraged me as well. I'm a little bit ahead of you in years, but it's great to have watched your journey recently at the IMC and to get to know you through our service on the Maxwell team. I feel I'm really blessed because of that relationship. Payne, thanks again for being on Titans of Transition today.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for joining me today on Titans of Transition. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Please check the show notes for additional information. Also, please like and subscribe to this channel.